Hi, and thanks for joining me. Tonight's very special guest is renowned author Andrew Lownie, and we're going to be discussing his book, The Mountbattens, Their Lives and Loves. And I can't wait to chat to him about it because there's a lot more to this story than you might actually realise. Hello, Andrew. It's lovely to speak with you again.
Well, very nice to be back again. Thank you for asking me.
I'm really excited to talk to you about the Mountbatten book. There's so much to cover. We might need to do about 10 episodes, I think, but I'll let you get away with just one. I wanted to ask you, what led you to write this book?
Well, I wrote the book really after doing a biography of Guy Burgess, who was a Cambridge spy. And Guy Burgess had been at a prep school called Lockers Park and then at Dartmouth. And as a result of that, I read the official life of Lord Mountbatten, who'd also been at Lockers Park and Dartmouth slightly earlier, just to get a bit of background. And it occurred to me reading it that here was this huge, long book, but actually it was pretty anodyne. And there was clearly a very fascinating character here who had never really been given the Lownie treatment. He was this colossus figure who sort of strode the whole of the 20th century, had very close royal links, last godchild of Queen Victoria, great-grandson, and only died, at the end of the 1970s. And it was a very dramatic life. It had, glamour, it had controversy, and it had a lot of mystery about it. How had this man achieved so much? I mean, was he supremely talented, or was he sort of pushed forward by very powerful mentors? So that's how it began, really.
When you're talking about the Lownie treatment, I know what you mean because I've read all your books. But for someone who hasn't read any of your books, what is the Lownie treatment?
Well, the Lownie treatment is supposed to take controversial figures and to put them under the microscope and to really dig deep into the files and into the archives to try and present a more accurate picture than some of these powerful people who've been sanitized by subsequent historians. And I suppose to mix the private and the public, because I do think the private life does impinge on the public life. One of the themes of the book was the very open marriage that Edwina and Dickie Mountbatten had, but also what a powerful public partnership it was. And a lot of success did depend on his wife. So I think it's just an attempt to try and be slightly more accurate, people might say more critical, of some of these great heroes, and to see that they perhaps did have feet of clay, to understand what makes them tick. I think that we still have too many, particularly royal biographies, which are in the 19th century, and it's all about hagiography rather than trying to understand the person and their influence.
One of the things that fascinates me is the way you have actually told the story of the couple, because I think that gives us a real insight into the real person. And you've actually done that now in another book. You did that, of course, with Wallis and King Edward VIII, or David. And do you really enjoy that? Do you love the fact that you're seeing and writing about a relationship?
Yes, I think we're all fascinated by relationships and what makes them tick and why people are drawn to each other and how they survive or don't survive. So it is quite a useful prism to use. I mean, when you write a biography, you're always having to write about the partner anyway. And so why not make that a feature of the story? And I think it's particularly true of the period I was writing about, which was the mid-20th century, because clearly they wrote letters to each other. And so you can begin to sort of chart that relationship. It's much more difficult now doing Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, because clearly there are no letters. So you're relying on what people say to you, or coverage in the press, or other ways of researching it. But I agree. I mean, I'm a great believer that the private is very much part of the public story. We're all, what drives us is in some ways our private life, and the public life is only the sort of public manifestation of that inner life. And one of the great challenges for biographers is to try and create that inner life, unless you have diary extracts or letters. And this was why it was so frustrating not to have access to 33,000 pages of letters and diaries between the couple, which would have humanized them, which would have filled out the story and possibly presented them in a much more attractive way than I was able to do.
Lord Louis Mountbatten was very conscious of his public image to an extreme degree. And my first introduction to him was the Noel Coward film. in which we serve, which really was just wartime propaganda. But I believed in the man and the myth and the legend when I was a little girl. You know, I was so impressed. Then I read the Noel Coward diaries, and I sort of picked up that he thought that he could at times be a bit of an arrogant person. And then I thought, well, when I read your book, that was when I got quite a shock, because you filled in a real person, and it wasn't always a very attractive portrayal. It was a very fair portrayal. But when I got to chapter 28, I'll confess, which is Andrew's Rumours chapter, when you get the book, don't skip to chapter 28. Make sure you read it first. But when I got to chapter 28 and I read it, I went back and reread the book because I wanted to read it knowing that man. And it really changed everything for me. How difficult was it putting that chapter into this book?
Well, for those who have not read the book, Rumours chapter looks at the accusations of Dickie's bisexuality. And I sort of wrestled with whether I would drop this in the course of the book, as people just perhaps discovered it, or as there were episodes of his bisexuality, or did I leave it for later on? And I thought it would be more effective to have, in some ways, this shock chapter suddenly at the end, when we're doing the summing up of his reputation and looking back on his life, to suddenly introduce this new element. And as you say, when you understand or have this new element into it, then it makes some of the earlier stuff much more understandable. The problems in the marriage, but also I think what shocked me was that so many people knew about it, covered up for it. Indeed, I have a story of his chauffeur from 1948, still alive, when I interviewed him a few years ago, who was instructed to show him the male brothel in Malta when he was posted there. So this was at a time when people were being thrown out of the Navy for homosexuality. And yet here was a man whose homosexuality was sort of being condoned by the establishment.
I suppose we have to point out that we're not actually homophobic when we're talking about bisexual and homosexual Lord Louis Mountbatten. The point that we're probably getting to is the fact that there was a dark side to this, a much darker side to this. We all know that homosexuality was illegal back then, but he used his power and influence in quite a dark way.
Yes, he was part of a network that operated in country houses around Ireland and elsewhere, where boys were brought to him and criminal acts took place. I spoke to two of these boys who were taken from a boys' home in Belfast and suffered with him in the August of 1977 when they were 16. And they knew things that clearly they couldn't have known about, for example, Classy-born, about him, unless they'd met him and suffered what they did. So there is a dark side. And I think that dark side goes back to a time when he was recuperating from an illness as a teenager and had a private tutor down at Bridport in Dorset. This man never married, later became a Church of England minister. And it was the man who married him. And one of the extraordinary things is he'd kept in touch with this man, but there was nothing in the voluminous records kept at Southampton about him, apart from a love letter, which I found in Miscellaneous 1916, which clearly had missed the weeding process. And so this gave me a sense that, it was an extraordinary letter professing his love for the boy. And my speculation is that this character, in some ways, determined Mountbatten's later behaviour. And actually, as a result of writing of that Rumours chapter, many other stories have come forward from other people. They're stories of, for example, often coming to me as an agent, so by chance. But I was going to do the memoirs of a woman who ran a brothel in London, and he was one of the visitors who liked dressing up as a baby. Other people have come forward with stories, including reputable news journalists, not sort of nutters. So there is definitely a dark side to him. And I think what's so extraordinary, given how ambitious he was and determined to get to the top, that he was able to live this double life, not get caught and not jeopardize his future. But we see this so often with personalities now. They have this huge public persona as the sort of, newscasters who do like Hugh Edwards, who present the coronation, who turn out to have all sorts of odd quirks, sexual quirks. And so I think the thing is, Mountbatten knew he was safe, that there would be a murder around him of people. The press would be deferential. The palace could shut down any story they wanted using FOI exemptions, denotices, whatever it was. But as you say, it was an abusive relationship often, because often these were junior officers whose prospects depended on keeping in with him, and people who were often in a position not to complain about their treatment. And it is very dark, because here was a man who held himself up to the highest standards and yet had this, I would say, dirty little secret in his life.
The Belfast boys' home that you refer to is Kincora. And there's a lot in the media about Kincora. More and more is coming out all the time. And obviously there seems to go very deep as far as the people that enabled that abuse to go on, the high connections in, the highest reaches of government, the police, all sorts of things. One of the things that would actually provide definitive proof is the car logs of cars coming and going from Classiebawn. Now, I believe that you have fought the good fight trying to get those car logs, because in reality, you could prove his innocence or you could prove his guilt if you could just get hold of these car logs. So what's that story?
Well, you're absolutely right. What happened is the security desk at Classiebawn would log every car that came in. And you would be able to trace the origins of the car if they came from Belfast, if you had the car logs. Now, that doesn't mean that every car from Belfast was involved with Kincora. It doesn't mean that people couldn't come from Kincora in a different car from somewhere else. But it would at least, if one could show that there were, on those particular days that the boys claim, and that was only ever in Classiebawn in August, so we're only looking at a very limited period of time. One of the things that actually came out of the release of the diaries and letters was it showed that he was at Classiebawn on the days that they claimed to have gone. Now, that material wasn't available to them until recently, so they couldn't have made that up. So that's, again, part of the evidence. But you're absolutely right that the Garda have admitted that they still have those car logs from over 40 years ago, and they're not releasing them. And their argument is that the Mountbatten murder is an active investigation. Well, the fact is that someone went to prison and came out under the Good Friday Agreement. So it's people have served their time. A few weeks ago, the Mail on Sunday ran a story saying that someone else had confessed to the murder, and the pressure was put on the Garda to investigate them. They said they would be taking no action. Now, that doesn't suggest it's an active investigation if they're not taking any action. But we've had the same thing with Prince Andrew, the famous night when he met Virginia Giuffre and claimed that he was always down in Sunninghill, and everyone says that he was in London. We could know for certain what happened by looking at the car logs for Buckingham Palace. According to his protection officer, he came back to Buckingham Palace. It caused a furore because he wasn't expected. He wasn't signed in. And under data protection, the police protection officer asked to have those logs released to him, which he's entitled to have, and he was told they'd been destroyed. Now, I don't believe that for 1 minute. But again, if this material had been released, it would identify once and for all whether Andrew was in London that night or not. And so you have to wonder time and time again, why are people so reluctant to release information that could clear people if they had nothing to hide?
Exactly. And also, Lord Louis Mountbatten was reluctant to have security often. He sort of presented it like it was because he was brave, but it was probably because he wanted to get on with his nefarious activities. Could that be the reason?
Absolutely. And that was always the rumor, particularly in a lot of the activities happened in Ireland. I think he just felt freer. He was on holiday, but as you say, there was less supervision. People say that's not true, but he once got all the way to Dublin without anyone even noticing that he had left. Classieborn. This is hundreds of miles away. So his security wasn't very good. He certainly wasn't keen on it. I mean, the line was he was on holiday with his grandchildren. He didn't want people around. But he was used to having security around. And, all the members of the royal family get used to having people literally there the whole time. Yes, you have to ask, why was he so keen not to have security when the threat of danger to him was enhanced, particularly that particular year? And he was told not to go to Ireland by everyone. So he went and he put his own family in danger by so doing.
Do you think there's any opportunity with harsh reality, will any more be uncovered? Do you think anything more is going to come to light? Can it come to light?
Yes, one lives in hope. Things are found down the back of cabinets. Children speak out finally after someone dies. Who knows? With the change of regime, one might have more openness. For example, people had great hopes when a new Garda senior officer was appointed in the belief that he would be more open about releasing files. It hasn't happened. But we had this extraordinary moment when I was doing the Guy Burgess book of Glasnost, where the Russian files were opened. And ironically, we were able to get more information about spying from the Russian side than we could from the British or American side. So, yeah.
That would have been so exciting. You must have been beside yourself with excitement when that happened.
Well, it was exciting. I mean, the problem is that they only, of course, released things that made them look good. So you have always got to be careful that you're not being played. That, there is a game here, a PR game. But, often, with the PR game, the beneficiaries are the historians because stuff gets made available. But, yeah, we wait for more Glasnost in Ireland and Britain. And I don't have high hopes that's going to happen, but we live in hope.
Well, if it ever does happen, I know who will be there first.
I'll be at the front of the queue. Yeah.
So I want to take you back through the book and sort of examine a bit of his wartime career. And I noticed a curious lack of empathy, sort of a bit of a pattern through the book where he used to make these decisions that really impacted other people and often resulted in injury, loss of life, the worst possible thing happening. And yet he seemed to get awarded and he used to get medals for behaviour that really would have got anyone else court-martialed. How did you pull that off?
Well, good question. I think he had a certain sort of autism. From the time of his honeymoon, when everything had to be sort of planned out. And I think one of the elements of autism is a lack of empathy. I think also he was a narcissist, so everything was about him, how things would look for him, how it would affect his career. And he didn't really care about others. I think one of the ironies is that he actually was quite a good leader, and he did appear to care about the people under his command. He learned who people were. He always said thank you. He was prepared to lead from the front. So he had great leadership qualities in many respects. But you're right, whether you're talking about Dieppe or India or in his time on HMS Kelly, where he ignored orders, 28 sailors were killed with a torpedo attack. And instead of being court-martialed, as everyone wanted, he went and got the DSO and was made into a hero. And this is just really about the power of the establishment to take care of their own, to turn, I suppose, defeat into victory. And many of these things depended on Edwina going and fluttering her eyelashes at George VI. And so she was his secret weapon. She was deployed basically to clear up some of his messes. But people were very forgiving because of who he was. And, we still in Britain have this deference. And we, particularly with the royal family, we let them get away with murder that other people wouldn't be able to get away with. So it is odd.
Sorry, the real story of the Kelly, I found that fascinating in your book. And you tell it, which the fact that he was off chasing U-boats when he shouldn't have been chasing them and when he sent the message.
Yes, well, I mean, he's the one and only captain of the Kelly because basically it spent most of its career in dry dock being fixed after problems he'd created, whether it was running over mines or being torpedoed. Then eventually it was sunk at the Battle of Crete, which inspired in the famous Noel Coward film. But yeah, he would go chasing U-boats when he wasn't a team player. He wanted the glory and the action. He thought he knew better than anyone else. and he didn't play as part of the team, which is why he was so distrusted by senior commanders and by his senior colleagues. But he wanted the glory, and it was always about him rather than about the bigger picture.
With Dieppe, I wanted to ask you, commandos and experienced troops were sort of substituted with inexperienced Canadian troops before that actual attack. Do you think there was something nefarious in that? Do you think they knew that it was going to be a disaster, that there was going to be mass casualties, and they didn't want to risk their good troops? So they put in troops that to them were more disposable. I know that sounds really harsh, but do you think there could be an element of truth in that?
Well, I mean, that was certainly what they used the Indian troops for in the First World War. No, I don't. I mean, I think that the decision was a political decision, Dieppe. It was to take pressure off the Eastern Front. It was to show Stalin that we were sort of preparing for D-Day. And the Canadians were the ones who lobbied to take part. I think wiser council would have seen that they were inexperienced. I mean, there were some commando troops on the wings. But I think why Dieppe went wrong was that people began to see that it was a pretty crazy operation. And so everyone began to pull people back. So there wasn't proper air cover, there wasn't proper sea cover. The intelligence wasn't very good. And of course, then a whole series of other factors led to the problems, so that people didn't arrive in the right time. It hadn't been thought through. I mean, people were being basically, at the point of pistol, being taught to get off the boat, and they were being mowed down on the beaches. And the tanks, they hadn't done their intelligence, so the tanks were stuck, marooned on the shingle. It was just badly organized. And that was partly because he put his mates in to do some of these jobs, and they weren't up to the job. He was left slightly to carry the can. Bernard Montgomery had been involved in the operations and others. But the point is that the whole thing should have been called off, and he decided to go ahead with it because, again, it was all about possible glory, and he hadn't thought through the consequences for others. Now, there is a theory that this was really a cover for a pinch raid, and a pinch raid was to steal basically material, ultra material that was needed. The War of the Atlantic was not going well. Allies were not able to read German codes. They changed to a different code system. And the attempt was to actually go and capture some material which would allow them to break the codes. And certainly a lot of the focus of the attack was on a place where these codes were kept. Now, it seems a very drastic thing to do, to capture codes, to lose literally thousands of troops. But I think given the importance of the Battle of the Atlantic, that certainly carries some weight. But I think, to be honest, it was just a cock-up. And one of the other interesting things is people like Ian Fleming were on the Dieppe raid watching. Now, why would you have a senior naval intelligence officer on a raid like that who knew a lot of the secrets unless there was something very important happening? But I think the thing is that it was called off. The Germans knew something was likely to happen. And instead of just cancelling the thing, that didn't happen. One of the problems is the secrecy around the raid, and one of the arguments for the secrecy is that it was a pinch raid, and therefore they didn't want people to know about it. So I think the debate still goes on about Dieppe. I mean, he took a lot of the flack, and he spent a lot of his subsequent career trying to explain himself to people. At least he tried to do that. But the problem was that there were too many cooks and no real person who was shaping the operation and that it had a clear objective.
That was a really powerful part of your book when they were actually forcing the young soldiers off the boats at pistol point. That was when I was reading that, I just had to put the book down and just go, because you could just imagine and feel that moment that they had no choice. The choice was die or die.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it is shocking. And the fact there'd been no contingency to withdraw the troops. I mean, you always work out what you're going to do if things go wrong. But I think also this haunting picture of the bodies being washed up, literally for weeks afterwards. And these, we put a lot of emphasis now on D-Day and the young troops going into action there. But I mean, what it must have been for those boys at Dieppe, is very hard to believe.
And I suppose that's the only sort of positive, is that the lessons learnt from Dieppe obviously saved lives on D-Day, which you point out in your book. So that's the one good thing that came out of all that death and horror, I guess.
Yes, I mean, well, absolutely. And I mean, that was always Mountbatten's argument. But in some ways, you could have learnt some of those lessons.
Oh, no, I don't want to argue for Mountbatten. I'll take that back.
It's not a good idea. You can work that out. But yes, certainly, I think they were certainly much more cautious in the future. And I think one of the things it showed was that you had to, you couldn't take a port, that you had to attack it from behind, which is what they did at Cherbourg, and you had to create these basically these artificial harbours, the Mulberry harbours. So I suppose that was one of the lessons. This was not, you were not going to take anything on D-Day with that sort of approach.
Right. King Edward VIII, when he was the Prince of Wales, and he went off on his world tour in 1920, and Dickie accompanied him, and Lord Louis Mountbatten, well, he sort of tried to ingratiate himself with David, and he tried to take the place of the brother, Bertie, as the new best friend, as the closest confidant. When I was reading your book, you didn't say this, but I wondered, was there a romantic relationship on that boat?
Well, I mean, there's certainly been hints of some sort of homosexual relationship. I mean, both of them were bisexual. And there's some very odd pictures that were taken, which seem very homoerotic. I think there was certainly a romantic friendship. I think the Prince of Wales was very lonely. He didn't like doing these tours. He was involved. He was surrounded by stuffy old naval people. And Dickie, who was a little bit younger, was about the only person of his age and who was similar to him. They'd gone through very similar sort of training and backgrounds. And Dickie was very good at sucking up to rich and powerful people. But and I think he did, Dickie, I think, took him under his wing a little bit, funny enough, as the younger partner in this relationship, and gave him a lot of emotional support. One of the things I think that's interesting about that period is the letters that the Prince of Wales writes to his married girlfriends, which are written in baby talk. And he was emotionally stunted. And I think Dickie was able to sort of deal with that and to sort of act as just a good best friend. But there's certainly very odd things with them, in pools, naked together, looking very chummy. Very difficult to know what's going on. I don't think it was a physical relationship, but I do think there was probably some sort of homoerotic relationship. And of course, Dickie was meant to be the Prince of Wales had been his best man at his wedding in 1922, and Dickie was meant to be his best man in 1937 and was prevented from going by the royal family, saying no one would attend the wedding. And Dickie very smartly leaps from being ADC to King Edward VIII to literally the next day being ADC to George VI. He goes and has tea with George VI as soon as the abdication has taken place, as he realizes power is shifting. So he was pretty
obvious, really, wasn't he?
It was pretty obvious.
Yes, his new best friend was Bertie the next day.
I mean, how is he managing to be mentor to so many monarchs? But to be fair to him, he did stay in touch with the Duke of Windsor. He used to go and visit him when Wallis was away getting one of her facelifts. Wallis didn't like him. He didn't like Wallis. But the two men would meet up. And since Wallis had so many facelifts, they did see quite a lot of each other.
I was actually amazed when you had the letters from Dickie to his mother around the time when they were on the boat, and they were being very romantic, and they were saying that they were in each other's cabins all the time and they had all these intimate conversations and everything. I was amazed how much he told his mother. Do you know much about Dickie's mother?
Yes, a certain amount. I mean, he was very close to her. I mean, he was in effect a bit like Prince Andrew. He was part of the next generation of children and was almost like an only child as a result. So he got a lot of attention from his mother. They were very close. As you say, the letters are very intimate. He's very trusting. It's very old-fashioned in some ways because, I mean, here he is. He's in his 20s and he's writing to her as you would if you were an 8-year-old. And the extraordinary thing is when he's at Dartmouth, he writes to his mother about the beastliness and the showers and people getting into bed with each other. And most mums would have got in touch with Dartmouth and said, I'm not sure this is why we sent our sons here. But she seemed to take it in a stride. it is a very odd relationship. She didn't die that much earlier than he did. I mean, she lived to a grand old age, and he saw a lot of her. He was a bit of a mummy's boy.
Right.
So yes, it's a very, and we have this correspondence which was kept by both sides, which is very, very revealing, and hadn't really been used before, even by the official biographer.
Yeah, I sort of picked up that he was really trying to impress her. You know, he would even tell her really intimate details about every girl that he went out with and how the relationship was going. And, you know, yeah, it was.
Well, I think this is
very
part of the
strange.
autism. I mean, this is part of the sort of, he's very literal. And again, you see a lot of that in Prince Andrew. If you watch the Newsnight interview, he's answering things he thinks as accurately and honestly as he can. And it's the naivety and this literal responding to things without any sense of context or empathy, which I think they both seem to have. But his father died. It's one of the things that threw him together with Edwina, because both their fathers died very shortly after each other when they were in their early 20s, just before they got married. And so he lacked this father figure. He had an older brother, George, who was meant to be the great hero everyone had invested their hopes in, very much like Joe Kennedy, ahead of Jack Kennedy. And he loses his father. There's no sort of figure there. And I think the mum, stepped into that breach. But they wrote to each other all the time.
So Edwina, she comes across in your book as very complex character, particularly in the beginning of the book. She just seems really oversexed and aimless. And then when the war hits, she seems to come into her own and find the best of herself. She was still oversexed, but she wasn't aimless. So she sort of,
It was so good.
So many affairs. I don't know how the woman had time.
Well, her daughter said that she had 18 lovers. I think I got 16, so there are two out there. And I think that more keep coming forward.
I'm sure there's more. I'm sure there's more.
Many more. I mean, one of the things she called them her ginks. One of the problems is, how far these were sexual relationships and how far they were just the attention seeking. She was very attractive. She was very rich. And clearly a lot of men, and she was fun, and a lot of men sort of came around her. How serious the relationships were, I think, is debatable. But she was desperately seeking affection. I mean, again, parallels with Princess Diana. Very sad upbringing, not divorced parents, but a mother who died when she was young, brought up by sort of evil stepmothers and sent away to school. And, she found a sort of a purpose in life through her charity work, always much better with children and with animals than with adults. But again, needed that attention and affirmation from the attention of men. And then, of course, she got it later, as you say, the validation from her humanitarian work and the success of her organizational skills in running large organizations like St. John Ambulance. But it is a game of two halves, the book. The first half, you feel sorry for Louis because she's giving him such a hard time and he's so pathetic. Then she finds herself and she's off and she becomes a saint. And we get to know a little bit more about Dickie, who it turns out to have, as I say, feet of clay often.
I must admit, I do like Edwina a bit better than Dickie. I mean, she seems a bit more entertaining and interesting. But when I was looking at the photographs of her in India with Nehru, I looked at her and I thought, well, I couldn't see what he saw in her. She just looked sort of skinny and tired.
Yes, well, she was. And she wasn't old then. She was only in her late 40s. But I think she was vivacious. I mean, I'm slightly more cynical about the Nehru's relationship with her. I think he played them. He realized that by getting close to them, he would get what he wanted. I mean, when they left in 1948, she was in tears on the way back. He went and saw the next lover the next day. So, I mean, he was, again, difference between men and women. He kind of was able to compartmentalize her and move on. And for her, it was clearly a very important relationship. But they saw each other. They wrote the most, moving letters, the ones that have been made available through the official life. I mean, there are clearly many more closed. It is slightly odd. But both of them had this attraction to brown-skinned people. Dickie was very drawn to people from Sri Lanka. He was based, of course, in Sri Lanka and India during the war. One of the boys that was interfered with was Sri Lankan. And she had a series of lovers who were black, Robeson, Hutchinson. So, and there were lots of stories about him with Indian princes when they were there. I mean, even as viceroy, he was having these homosexual affairs. So I think in some ways it doesn't surprise me. And the fact that there were so many stories about them so early on, from so many different sources, suggests that there was a sexual relationship with Nehru very early on. It wouldn't make sense to only begin that relationship later. And the line that was given by the family was, first of all, that it was completely platonic, which would be odd for both those two, because, as you said, they were both highly sexed, and then that he was impotent. So the story keeps changing about the nature of the relationship.
Right. I wanted to get on to Dickie's relationship to his daughter, Patricia. Now, you sort of give us a good idea about that relationship, and you're very fair. It was the letter to Patricia that, regardless of anything you said, I had my suspicions from the way you told the story. But when I read this letter, I'm just going to quote a little bit from it, and then I'm going to get your opinion. It was this letter that just blew me away. And this little quote: physical attraction, and then in brackets, by no means unknown to Freud, between parents and children, end bracket, has hardly ever entered into our very remarkable friendship. And I thought, what parent would write that physical attraction has hardly ever entered into our remarkable friendship? Yes. I mean, what parent would write that to their child? It's weird.
Yeah. Yes, well, it is a very weird relationship. I don't think it's that letter, but he writes and says to Pamela, the younger daughter, "I only love you because you're the sister of Patricia." One of the things
I've got that quote. But it is the same letter. But the mainspring of my love is that she is your sister and you love her. So he loves Pamela because Patricia loves her.
Yeah.
I mean, poor Pamela.
Yes.
Have you ever spoken to Lady Pamela Hicks? Have you ever?
I've interviewed her, yes, and she was very open and very. She was the one who told me that when Dickie was in India and having an affair with this woman Janie Lindsay, and she said, but by the way, you probably know she was also having an affair at the same time with Bunny Phillips. Now, Bunny Phillips was the person that Edwina came close to marrying. So you have Dickie sleeping with his wife's boyfriend's girlfriend. And we had the same thing with Jean Norton and Lord Beaverbrook. Jean Norton, who was Lord Beaverbrook's girlfriend, also slept with Dickie, and Edwina slept with Lord Beaverbrook. So you've got these foursomes the whole time. It's almost like a sort of Poussin dance. They come in and out. The extraordinary things in the letters and diaries that were released by Southampton recently was a letter between Dickie and Edwina. And he was talking about his complex and basically trying to explain it. And his complex was he got off sexually by watching his daughter Patricia ride, particularly in her riding kit. His valet said that, men have pornographic magazines. He had Horse and Hound. That's where he got his kicks, looking at girls and riding breeches. He was, an odd man. And so this is the slightly odd thing, that there was some sort of, I wouldn't say incestuous relationship with his daughter, but he certainly fancied her. She was quite masculine. Pamela is a much more attractive woman, much more like Edwina. But Patricia was always there. She married very young, I think partly maybe to escape from her family. She had a very dominant husband who got on very well with Dickie, Lord Brabourne. And Patricia was always basically his plus one when Edwina wasn't around. And so there's a very interesting family dynamic, which one can get a hint of, often very difficult to fully explore.
There's another quote from that letter. You know how basically fond I am and always have been of Mummy. You know pretty well about my girlfriends, but none of them have had that magic something which you have.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
an
just,
extraordinary letter to write to anyone. I mean,
yes.
A father to his daughter. And I can't remember the timing. She's just married with young children, isn't she, at this point? I think it's the late 40s.
Yes, and he just wants to have it on paper that she knows how he really feels about her.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's a letter I would have wanted to have got from my father.
No, exactly. No, that's very well. He was very honest, which is great for a biographer. This stuff, he does put it all down. And again, this is why the letters to Edwina that were released are very interesting, because they are very open with each other. But I mean, there's a famous letter where he writes to Edwina saying, I realize I'm not a great success in your eyes. I can't dance. I can't play the piano, and all these other boyfriends can. But I'm devoted to you. And she just ignores it for a year and doesn't respond. I mean, how heartless can you be?
Yes, that got me. I remembered that out of the book. Yes. She had all these affairs, and it was such a heartfelt letter. And she just went, oh, didn't answer him. She left him hanging. It was just awful. Really awful.
I think that's one of the things one's supposed to do in a biography is you've got to, your sympathies are varying the whole time between the different parties as new facets of their character are revealed. And so I quite like that. If they were goody-goodies all the way through, it wouldn't be so much fun. You've got to have that moment.
It wouldn't be as interesting a book, would it? Prince Louis of Battenberg, first Sea Lord, had an affair with Lily Langtry.
And possibly a child. And had a tattoo.
How did you get that? Because everybody else thinks it was another guy, Arthur Jones or someone like that. It's a very sort of innocuous name. But how did you find that out?
Well, I don't think that we don't know for sure. So you're absolutely right. The parentage could be either. But certainly the child who became quite a famous television presenter, I think, was sure that it was Lily Langtry. And I can't remember what other evidence I produced, but it wouldn't be surprising because he was a bit of a rogue, the father. I mean, what you find is always this pattern of behavior in the royal family. Prince Andrew is a bit of a philanderer, but so was his father. And Dickie, in some ways, was a bit of a philanderer because that was the example that had been set to him by his father.
So you're working currently on your Sarah and Andrew book, or have you finished it? Is the first
draft halfway
done?
Through? So hopefully it will be out next spring. And I've been following your take on Sarah Ferguson. It's been great. I mean, really interesting insights. And I think you share my view that she's a bit of a Becky Sharp.
Yes, I think so. Have you got any sort of wish list of anyone else you'd like to write about after Sarah and Andrew, or are you going to take a break for a while?
No, I'd like to do Prince Philip because I think Prince Philip is one of the major royal figures who's never really had a proper biography. He's an important figure in shaping the monarchy. He's up there with Prince Albert. Clearly a very interesting, complex man. There's contradictions between this, rugged naval character and the sensitive artist who's interested in theology. So, I mean, he's a very interesting character. I think he kept the whole show on the road, particularly in the 1950s and 60s. And of course, there's the whole private side of his life, which has never been touched on. And clearly a lot of people have died, but people are now more prepared to talk about it. Now the Queen is also dead. So I think that's the next one. He's always fascinated me. And there will be some papers to draw on, I hope. One of the problems is that he was sorting his papers at the end of his life, and a lot of those papers were sorted into the incinerator. So it's going to be a bit of a race to find people who are prepared to talk.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for talking to me about all of this. It's just absolutely fascinating. And I hope to get you back at some future date because I'd love to talk to you about Stalin's Englishman as well. That's a whole big story in itself, but I'll give you a break for a while.
No, always have to talk to you.
Give you a chance to write.
Right. Well, look forward to whenever we fix something, but another rogue.
Yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.